Simply put, on a day-to-day transaction level, if the proper procedures for good governance are followed, it makes bribes harder to give and harder to conceal, and at the decision-making level, it injects transparency and accountability. I think the efforts of the extractive industries transparency initiative in particular is a case in point, particularly around the notion of transparency and disclosure. There's also the work of the Co-Roundtable, an organisation of business leaders which has sought to play with the ethical dimension of business conduct, but importantly also recognises the different cultural contexts in which ethics is interpreted around the world. And I think that's an area we have to be particularly sensitive to in this environment post the global financial crisis, and I'll say a little bit on that before I close. We also have the OECD multinational corporate governance guidelines, but underpinning much of this is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was signed to by or ascribed to by the United Nations, and really is enshrined in many of these different conventions and guidelines, from the OECD's Anti-Bribery Convention to the UN Convention Against Corruption, the World Economic Forum's Partnering Against Corruption Initiative, and there are just a whole host of others that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But as the point I made earlier on is we still sit here today deliberating on what to do, notwithstanding this plethora of standards and guidelines, and therein is probably the challenge. If someone can find the answer to that, then we're probably going to make a big step forward. Another area that's becoming of increasing interest, at least to me, and some involvement I've recently had, is the role of investors, who have an important role to play in the issue of anti-corruption. And increasingly you're seeing them taking a more active role in there, from the International Corporate Governance Network through to the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, where it's calling on its signatories to the UN PRI initiative to take an active approach in assessing and evaluating companies' position and disclosures around its procedures for reporting and monitoring potential corrupt activities. This really is an enhanced focus on a company's effective corporate governance processes in terms of its risk management and internal controls. As you well know better than I, you have the Global Reporting Initiative as well, which increasingly has a focus on this area, and there's a number of other initiatives that one can certainly refer to. But I think, of course, the role of investors in this process and shareholders is very limited, bearing in mind that they mostly are going to be active in markets where there's a capacity for them to make any significant investment, a capacity for them to act in their proper role as shareholders, and in terms of engaging with shareholder meetings and the executives that run the businesses. So this is not necessarily a proposition that would be useful across many of the developing countries, such as in Africa. That really then brings me to another quick snippet, as I basically try and rush through some of the highlights for discussion, and that is the role of the world corporate titans, these massive multinational corporations. And the recent cases in Germany with Siemens, Daimler, and now it seems Hewlett-Packard's German subsidiary seem to be symptomatic of either outright neglect or just sheer arrogance. I think, and a question I have to ask myself, given the historical practice that whereby German companies used to get a tax dispensation for facilitation payments, is whether that in some process or other you've got this in sort of almost structure that's been built into companies. I think what surprises me often is that the ethical behavior of companies is really recognized as a cornerstone of good corporate governance. So I won't be much longer then. I can see you looking at me anxiously. I think what I just wanted to make a few points on that is that in terms of companies, it's interesting, particularly around the ability of the business leadership to really set the moral guidelines of behavior, both explicitly and implicitly. I think we've got both good examples of where companies have really sought to improve their practices and standards. We heard an example yesterday around Nike. There's also a more recently example of Walmart in the US, where their companies have started with a poor reputation and are really seeking to set new benchmarks for corporate ethics. On the other hand, you have companies that proudly profess strong ethical standards and cultures, and then we look at what happened to Enron. I think the real issue for many cases is around the issue of leadership. One of the issues that I had hoped to share with you, and I hoped will be finally delivered from Customs later today, are a number of publications that the Global Corporate Governance Forum has issued on the issue of corruption and corporate governance, including a brochure that's been widely circulated in partnership with the Global Compact. One of the concluding comments I want to make before I wrap up is the global financial crisis and the impact it has on all of this. And I think one of the things that's interested me in the debate over the last day or so is that, in my opinion, the global financial crisis has significantly weakened the so-called dominant economies of the developed world, mainly the Western countries. And the danger that I think we're running into often is that we're informing our debate around issues and customs and practices that we've taken for granted by virtue of the dominance of these markets in the global economy. The question is now, with the rise of significant giants such as India, such as China, the increasing propensity for South-South investment, is we have to be very sensitive that these countries do not necessarily see these issues in the same way that we do. And I think that would be worth a discussion in the course of today. And I wonder how much of this is going to start informing the way we look at international standards in terms of any rework that is going on currently. I think also what I find, at least in the work I've done in those parts of the world, is a much greater level of assertiveness of what they will accept and what they won't accept, and what they will do and what they won't do in terms of what we think are the norms. And there's a whole set of infrastructural issues that one can discuss around that. But I think, let me conclude at this point, and I'm happy to answer questions when the panel is open for discussion, just to simply end off by saying I've certainly enjoyed being here. I've enjoyed some of the discussions. But I think one of the challenges for all of us is the question of trade-offs highlighted by Bobby Godsell, and the need for a capacity for flexibility and negotiation in terms of trying to find some common ground and some common cause that helps all of us, in the interests of community generally, seek to address some of the issues of corruption that challenges not just Africa but many countries around the world. Thank you.